What happens when corporations do bad? What can people do? Well, as it turns out, there are many means of nonviolent direct actions that people have and done and continue to take. And I'll just talk you through a few brief ones. So from their book, Business Ethics, Craig and Mathen talk about nonviolent direct action in their chapter, Civil Society and Business Ethics, because, of course, at the heart of many of the forms of direct action are civil society organizations. So what do we do when corporations do bad? Well, demonstrations, marches, like you've heard of demonstrations and marches, even surrounding Brexit. We know that there are many people who demonstrated and marching. We know that the civil rights movement was many of the most visible aspects were demonstrations and marches and protests. What about letter and email campaigns? Of course, now we have social media. But even from the early days of activism before the internet, we know that there were letter campaigns, and Amnesty International is famously one of those organizations that organizes those all around the world to both raise awareness of some malfeasance going on by government or organizations around the world, but also to raise awareness for people about what's going on over there, because sometimes what's going on over there can come over here. Occupations, we know about Occupy Wall Street. And I also, as a student at Oberlin College, we occupied the admin building when they wanted to close the dining hall in the Africana student hall. Nonviolent sabotage and disruption. Well, we know that there have been many organizations such as Greenpeace, even in the early 80s, that one of their campaigns was to stop whaling, and they would literally place themselves between a whale and a whaling ship. So sabotage and stunts like that, but also picketing. I want to mention one that we often don't talk about, and that's boycott, because I think many of us have done it. So on the next page, they define a boycott as a form of ethical consumption. And something like 30% of people claim to have boycotted or are willing to boycott a product for ethical reasons. It's a coordinated endeavor among a group of consumers to refrain from making specific purchases. Its goals may be to directly influence corporate policy or to achieve other objectives through collective action. So someone has to coordinate this collective action, right? Someone has to say, hey, do you see what's going on over there? And they're doing something bad. So why don't we just not patronize them and let them see what happens? You know, we talk about consumers voting with their feet. You know, we'll walk away. Well, some of the most famous ones, there's a chart on the next page, and I'll just briefly go through a few. So here in the UK, you might know about the 2003 boycott of KFC because of the cruelty to animals in their animal chain, and that was raised by PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And many of you have heard about their very early campaigns in the early 80s, stemming from the early 80s when they would throw ketchup on people wearing furs because they wanted people to boycott the fur industry. PG Tips, 2004, Captive Animals Protection Society, Captive. So they had advertisements with a chimpanzee, a dancing chimpanzee. Of course, this is again making light of captured animals, something that a lot of people don't like. In 2006, The Body Shop, such an ethical organization. I mean, they really raised the profile of fair trade as a marketable way to consume beyond just coffee. It's many people attribute this brand to raising the profile of fair trade in every, commodity that we use, especially cosmetics, because it's such a big and expensive industry with high profit margins. Well, they sold out. They sold out to a French conglomerate, L'Oreal, and that organization, as we know, does all kind of animal testing, and they're the organization that PETA, one of the organizations that PETA literally targets. And then one that I was involved in 2012 in America, Chick-fil-A. Honey, that was sad because they make some great lemonade and everyone loves a chicken patty sandwich. But it turns out that their president, was funding anti-gay organizations and made some very anti-gay statements in public on Twitter, and tweeted about it and all that kind of stuff. So people boycotted it. I even have a video about it on YouTube where I walked up to one of the Chick-fil-A's and I sincerely tried to hold a dialogue. I did hold a dialogue with the workers and asked them how they felt about how their organization was being represented. And true to form, they were working class people who wanted to keep their mouths shut because they wanted to keep their jobs, and just depend on the graciousness of the particular manager that they had on whether or not they could be out about their support of human rights in the workplace. So that organization, they have a big office in Montgomery, Alabama, where I recently visited, and it reminded me of I would say the original boycott. Of course, the Montgomery bus boycott. We know that in December 1955, Rosa Parks, a trained and seasoned activist in nonviolent direct activism, had enough. That summer, Emmett Till had been brutally tortured and murdered for making a pass at a white woman who was 14 years old in Mississippi. And so that December, she no longer wanted to ride segregation on the buses. It was one of the ways that she was daily affronted, going back and forth to work and home. You have to sort of see, blacks sit here and whites sit here. And she was asked to give up her seat, and all she did was simply say no. Well, she stood up for a movement because a boycott ensued. It lasted over a year, and they suffered greatly. They were bullied. They were not protected from mob violence. They were targeted when they tried to organize carpools. They were targeted by mobs and police, and yet they stayed the course. And of course, we know that boycott kicked off the entire civil rights movement. When we say civil rights movement, it's important to understand that this one conflict was a boycott. Came down to a boycott of the local municipally sanctioned bus system that enforced a very unethical practice and system of laws that we call Jim Crow. So now today, as a consumer, you've seen it. Nike, there was a backlash towards Nike supporting Colin Kaepernick's Take a Knee. This was even before George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So we know that there was both a big push on social media to boycott Nike and burn Nike paraphernalia by people who felt that they didn't understand the human rights aspect of what Colin Kaepernick was doing, until, of course, George Floyd. But Nike stayed the course, and many people, if there could be an opposite of boycott, many people, including me, said, you know what, I'm going to support that brand. So what about you? Have you been involved in any sort of direct nonviolent action to help a corporation change its ways? Letter campaigns, online postings, hashtags about what corporations are doing to raise awareness. We welcome you to share those ideas, because it's amazing what we can do when we work together. That's what they say, pull together.